Hello, everyone, and welcome to the next segment of AP Government and Politics. So, clearly, when you look at current events wise, this is a big deal, right? Schools are now closing around, and we'll talk more about current events when we do return to class. But we did mention last time that this could happen, and it's showing that even politically, this is now growing and growing as a major issue. So, I just want to, instead of just talking about current events, we could talk more about more about that in person. So I want to continue with the last segment of Chapter 12. Now, when it comes to the assessment for Chapter 12, we'll have to talk about that when we get back. Because now the fact that we are out a week, we were supposed to have our quiz on it Monday, but that's not going to happen. So we'll have to look into a different way in which we'll assess Unit 4. So for this video today, we're going to finish up with Chapter 12 and start Chapter 13, which would be the final unit of our course. Okay, so let's get started. So the last time we were here, guys, if you remember, we were talking about the different things in which the Fed could do to basically try to help stimulate the economy, and it's almost perfectly aligned with what was going on in current day society, where President Trump was asking the Fed to help along with what was going on with the stock market. And we talked about the different things that could actually happen, or what things you could do if you were in the position of the president to try to have the Fed help stimulate the economy. Now, unfortunately for him, it didn't go so hot. And unfortunately for all of us, it didn't go so well. Even our stock market game is not going so well. I haven't even checked the updates of today, but let me tell you, it seems as though all of us are kind of crumbling in that game. It's going back up again today, according to recent reports, which is a good thing. But hopefully it stays along that path. Now, recent history of just how much it's been decreasing, it's kind of scary, but let's just continue along. We were talking about all the different things about how the Fed can help. It was a pretty, I think that there's a lot of, it could be very confusing at times, but once you get the handle of what they're adjusting, it makes a lot of sense, basically allowing the banks to kind of invest more in the stock market to allow the stock market to elevate itself. And unfortunately, though, when that happens, it means that there's getting a loan for a house, getting a loan for something else is much more difficult and a lot more expensive when these times of crisis are happening. That's why people you don't really see during times of recession, they aren't trying to go out and buy a house, because their loans are going to be so much more expensive because the interest rates are increasing for them. So the very last thing is that we're going to talk about today are going to be to talk about the different policies, the different perspectives on policy when it comes to social policy. So, for instance, one of the biggest things that we are debating today is having the ability to have Medicare and Medicaid, right? And that's still an evident debate going on in our government today. LBJ created these social insurance programs under the Great Society. Under LBJ had created these different social programs, specifically Social Security, right? But just to make sure you understand, Medicare is a federal program that provides health insurance to seniors and disabled at the ages of 65 and up. And those that do pay an additional tax on their Social Security will get Medicare Part B, which will approximately give them 80% of their will help them pay 80% of the doctor's bills. Now, what's important to understand is that Social Security and Medicare are the largest portion of the federal budget because it's a very expensive program. Now, not saying that that's what the budget's all going to this, but it's saying that those programs themselves are expensive and we do provide a lot. Medicaid is a federal program that provides health care for the poor, right? So as of 2012, U.S. has the highest Medicare cost in the world. And that's why you can see a debate going on between the Democratic Party and the Republican Party on whether or not they should get rid of these programs, right? The Democratic Party is fighting for it. Republican Party is saying there are other ways in which you can provide these safeguards for people and not have these programs in place. All right. One of the biggest programs that we see that the government provides for, even just more recent history, is the Affordable Care Act, signed in 2010 by President Obama, also known as Obamacare. All right. I think when it was first created, a lot of people used the term Obamacare to kind of go against President Obama itself, but people have to understand Affordable Care Act and Obamacare are the exact same thing. Now, in 2010, this was seen as a very radical leftist viewpoint. But as you can tell, and today with universal health care for all, that this concept is now not a more radicalized plan. It's more of a moderate plan of the versus Bernie Sanders. Now, I think when Republican Party was trying to get rid of Obamacare, there are now more people that say, listen, you can't get rid of it now. And I think we talked about this in class already, where the problem is that when you provide everyone a government funded insurance plan, and then you say, all right, we're going to get rid of that and allow it to go back to competition, it's hard because now you're putting all those people in the hands of insurance companies that might now say, well, you need insurance now, and that means we can charge you whatever amount we want you to because now you need it. So that's the problem, is that if you don't have a plan that can replace Obamacare without putting it in the hands of all the insurance companies, then people aren't going to be for that. And you could see that in 2016, 2017, where the Republican Party was they had control of both the House and Senate, and they wanted to get rid of Obamacare, but they didn't have a plan that was good enough to get people to be on board. And that's why when we look at public opinion, it plays a major role in how policies are shaped. So this provided more access to healthcare for people, but what it does allow is it does allow you to go out and get your own healthcare plan. It doesn't mean you have to have Obamacare. It means that you can get a better plan if whatever you deem to be better, and you can even fight for plans at your union. If you're in a union with your other workers, they can get a plan that will be provided by the company that you work for. So that is the positive when you look at it. As in it gives you a standardized plan, but it does allow you to have choice as well. Now, that's when there's a misconception. When you look at European nations across the world, Bernie Sanders always states that that's what Europe does. Not necessarily. Europe has a probably more similar plan to what Obamacare has. And it allows people to have choice, and it doesn't destroy the entire insurance industry, right? If you just have universal health care, that means that there's no use for having private insurance anymore, which could be a very bad thing. So that's what it's a big debate going on today, and that's why the likelihood of Democrats backing Joe Biden over Bernie Sanders seems more likely because they're more for the idea of having choice, right? Of having a decision on making your insurance plan rather than just being forced to have one. So when you look at this graph, it's actually pretty important to see that over the years you can see how much the Social Security and Medicare cost of a percentage of the GDP as it's increased over time. But as it's gotten to this point here, it's kind of going to stay the same. All right, it's going to stay, and these are the projections for over the next decades as we see here. But over the years, it has increased the Medicare and Social Security over time. So this is going to be one of the cartoons I want you guys to do for homework. It's a pretty good one. I think when I first saw it, it kind of, it goes along exactly with what is going on right now. So I want you guys to look at this cartoon, answer these 3 questions here, and then that'll be one of the things you submit for me for this weekend. So when also, not even just healthcare itself, but schools, right? School choice and competitions in the market. Now, there is a lot of debate on how much funding public school education should have, and even with the new Democratic Party platform, they're focusing more on providing more funding to education in general. You can look at any of the candidates, whether it's Joe Biden, Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren before she dropped out, everybody on the ballot was all stating that they wanted to have more funding into public education. Especially, I think it was Joe Biden that came out and said that he wanted to have at least $60,000 for any entry-level position in the country. So remember, in New York State, that's kind of standard. But when you look at places like West Virginia, Pennsylvania, all these other districts or other schools that the teachers are trying to basically walk out because their conditions are horrible. They're getting paid like probably $35,000 at an entry-level position, or even later on, many years in. That's not really technically a living wage when you're a full-grown, adult with kids and everything. So that's why they're trying to increase funding for these education programs to help that. Now, the opposite is when you have school voucher programs. So when you have people are trying to give them a chance to go into private schools, because that was what Betsy DeVos was trying to push for, was to give people tax credits to go and try to go into more private schools, and she was trying to fund these tax credits to allow people to go more into private and charter schools than public. And that's really a big debate because it's I mean, it's giving people choice. That's really the big thing that mainly the Republican Party is looking for, to give someone a choice, whether they want to go to public school or they want to go into charter or private schools. And it's a hard debate to have, because you have to understand more people are going to public schools. So that the idea is that whether they should fund more of those schools because that's the mass majority population is going there, or provide programs where they have a choice to go into private or charter schools. Now, it's a tough debate, and we can go more into that when we have our own debates, when we have our elections, but that's kind of the differences between the two, right? There are a lot of these voucher programs, and there's a lot of those individuals that are trying to push for more higher funding in public education. All right, so last two questions before we finish for today. First one, should the American government be responsible for providing healthcare to citizens, or should the decision to purchase healthcare be on individual choice? And secondly, do school choice programs like vouchers make schools better through competition, or do they drain necessary funds from the schools that need them the most? And then lastly, I'll probably have you guys look at this FRQ for Chapter 12. I think it's a pretty good one, and we'll probably just go through a little bit of Chapter 13 for this weekend, because remember, all of next week is also canceled as well. So we'll talk a lot more probably Chapter 13 and 14 as well. All right, so let's jump into Chapter 13 now. Alrighty, so we are at the final showdown, the final unit of AP Government and Politics. We're almost done. There are technically 4 chapters remaining. Now, this one's going to talk about political participation. All right, this one talks a lot about the different ways in which groups and individuals participate in our government and how they affect the different policies that come forth. So Chapter 13 is going to focus mainly on elections and campaigns. All right, so now we're going to look at different forms of political participation. Now, there are 5 sections of this chapter. We're probably going to cover either just section 13.1 and 13.2 just for today. All right, so political participation is pretty simple, the different ways in which individuals can take action to shape laws and policies of our government. Now, that's why this unit is pretty simple. It's pretty straightforward, because a lot of these concepts are pretty simple to many of you. What's important about the democratic system is that citizens have the ability to show what their feelings are, show their opinions on different aspects by different means, mainly by elections, all right? The show, if they agree with the politician or they disagree, will show you whether or not they get voted in or out, all right? And also on top of that, on different ways in which they vote, okay? Now, if citizens are coming out hard in an election, it means as though there is something going on that they feel very adamant about. Usually, a lot of times when elections aren't populated, it means that generally most Americans are okay with what's going on, or just don't really care as much to the point where they need to come out and vote. So that's why when you see most recent elections, the biggest voter turnout in many, many years, it tells you that it's been a hotbed issue of who should run the country. So one of the things, this is actually technically the last Supreme Court case that we are going to cover. So this is it, the big shebang, all right? When we talk about PACs, all right, and this is how we're going to transition. I'm going to give you guys the Citizens United Supreme Court case is going to be probably the assignment we do over this weekend, because this is the last Supreme Court case you should focus on, all right? But you need to know about political action committees, which are also known as PACs, okay? So money is a humongous factor in the electoral process, all right? You have to understand funding makes or breaks campaigns. And we've seen this in just more recent years, and even just this previous Democratic primary, that if candidates do not have funding, it means that they cannot afford ads, they cannot afford to throw events, and they cannot get any sort of sponsors or any sort of support for their campaigns, because they don't have the money to throw these types of bigger events and these gatherings for people for them to spread their word. All right, these town hall events are going to be pretty big for them to kind of get people on board onto their campaign. Now, FECA is basically a law that creates limits on PAC donations, monitored by the FEC, because the reality is we don't want money to dominate our campaigns, as in we don't want basically large donors to just run our country, because if we didn't have any regulations on PACs and how they get their money, then we're basically allowing the autocracy, not the autocracy, but the oligarchs to basically control everything about our government, and we're trying to limit that influence over our elections. Now, what's interesting though is that based on current laws of donations, any singular individual cannot spend more than $2,500 in a specific donation. But there's a lot of different ways around this. Okay, now that they have PACs, and then they also have super PACs, and we'll probably get more into that throughout the chapter. But PACs, are the direct political action committees, are associated with helping the candidates with funding. Okay, so there have been several Supreme Court cases that have gone into this issue of funding and how certain donations are being monitored. Specifically, Buckley v. Valeo, which basically created the standpoint of saying there's no limit on an individual spending their own money on their campaign. So that means that people that are loaded, that are running, they can spend any money that they want on their own campaign because it's their campaign. They can, that's why Michael Bloomberg, right? You can tell, spending close to $1 billion, $700 and somewhat million on his campaign because he has the money to do it. And he knows that he can spend it. And it almost worked. The problem is that we realize that money can't buy you victories. It can buy you a seat at the table. And that's kind of what happened with Michael Bloomberg. So this allows you to spend any amount of money of your money on the campaign. Now, they tried to basically put some sort of limits on the PACs because I understand that this is a very controversial issue. And we'll go more into it with the Citizens United worksheet. All right? So, let me just transition into that. All right, so here's the worksheet. Citizens United versus the FEC. Now, just to give you guys some background, we already talked briefly about what a PAC is, a political action committee, all right? Now, PACs have been around since the 1940s, and they've basically been used for people to donate to the political campaigns of individuals. Now, because there are a lot of regulations where you cannot donate directly to the individual, these political action committees are basically groups where the individual, the candidate themselves, is not technically running the campaign, the campaign committee. So you're not technically donating to them specifically. You're donating to their committee, and then that means that committee can then be used to basically use that money to help their campaign. Now, the way that there are actually a lot of regulations in which we can stop a certain amount of money to be funded to certain people because, like I said before, we don't want to have events where donors are going to control our candidates completely, and that's not what we want. We want them to feel like they are owed something to these specific people. That's why we want to stop a certain amount of ways in which people can donate a lot of money to certain groups. All right, so I probably misspoke before. It was not 2,500. It was actually 2,700. A specific person can donate to somebody else directly. So what happens in this case, and I want you guys to mainly do this on your own, but I want to give you guys just some background. So at least when I assign you guys the filling out the worksheet, we can actually talk about this on a later date. So I'll just give you just some background about PACs. We already talked about a little bit about them already. But I want you guys to fill out the facts and the discussion and the impact for yourselves, okay? And then we'll talk about that probably in the next video that's going to happen on Monday, all right? So like I already said, PACs have been going on for a very long time already, and they've been spending money and donating to elections in many different ways. Now, the reason why that we allow donations to be ramped up to the maximum in certain ways is because we associate spending money on candidates as a form of speech. Even if that speech is from a corporation, we consider that being a way of protecting free speech. Okay. Now, some of the things that we do restrict, though. So the Supreme Court has had several cases before where it restricts on how much a candidate can spend on a campaign, and that by basically having influence over, if we're spending too much money during a certain time, they actually limit that speech or that donation from being used. And that's kind of what along the lines of what Citizens United is basically talking about. All right, specifically, we're going to talk about how Citizens United had created almost a documentary of trying to get Hillary Clinton from not being elected. And they created a whole documentary about it, and they're doing it as a way to help influence the election in 2008. And we'll talk more about that probably in the next video, but I want you guys to do this last Supreme Court case analysis worksheet, and then we'll talk about that in the next video. All right. So that's going to be it for today. I want you guys to get this done over the weekend. You're only going to be doing the questions that go along in Chapter 12 that I talked about, and also just the Supreme Court case worksheet on the Citizens United versus the FEC.